Well, good afternoon everybody and welcome to the University of Nottingham. 2018 marks the 70th anniversary of Theology at the University of Nottingham. The department was created in 1948 as part of the expansion that followed the granting of the Royal Charter by the King in the same year. And that was the year, of course, when Nottingham became a university. Since then, we have become a department of theology and religious studies, and many distinguished scholars have engaged in teaching and research here. Within Christian theology, we may name Alan Richardson, Anthony Thistleton, and John Milbank. From religious studies, Douglas J. Davis and Hugh Goddard. Over 70 years, and of course inevitably, almost everything has changed about the department. Although, I hope, we maintain our central commitments to scholarship and also to open friendliness. One aspect of our life has remained remarkably consistent, not over the whole of the 70 years, but at least over the last 60, and that is the biennial Firth lectures. The Firth Memorial Lectureship was founded by the Reverend John Dew Evelyn Firth in memory of his father, John Benjamin Firth, who was a historian of Nottingham, and his mother, Helena Gertrude Firth. The brief given to the lecturer is that he or she should deliver a public lecture or lectures on some aspect of the Christian faith in relation to contemporary problems. The first person to hold the lectureship was the renowned American-German theologian Paul Tillich, and there have been a series of eminent theologians and philosophers who have included Baroness Warnock and Jürgen Moltmann. Recent Firth lecturers have included Terry Eagleton, Charles Taylor, and Rowan Williams. And all of those lectures were filmed by our colleagues who are filming this event today. And so they are available on the Firth website. Just Google Firth Lectures. This week, the Department of Theology and Religious Studies is honoured and delighted to welcome Professor John Barclay, who is delivering our Firth Memorial Lectures for 2018. And tomorrow morning, he will also lead a postgraduate seminar. Professor John Barclay is Lightfoot Professor of Divinity in the Department of Theology and Religions at the University of Durham. After undergraduate studies at Queen's College, Cambridge in classics and theology, he received his PhD, also from Cambridge, on Galatians. And then he became a lecturer, senior lecturer, and then a professor at the University of Glasgow from 1984 to 2003, which point he moved to Durham. Professor Barclay is hugely influential in the fields of New Testament studies and early Christianity, and much in demand as a speaker all over the world. In fact, he has just returned to our shores from an extended visit to New Zealand. So I trust you're feeling the right way up.
Yeah, thank you.
Good. Professor Barclay is also currently president of the British New Testament Society. His most recent book is a study of Pauline theology from the perspective of Paul's theology of grace, entitled Paul and the Gift, published in 2015. In it, he argues that if we read Paul's theology of grace in the light of ancient notions of gift, we can understand it in a new way, his relationship to Judaism, his theology of the Christ event, and his ethic of reciprocal generosity. For the 2018 Firth Lectures, Professor Barclay takes as his overall title, Beyond Charity, Gift, Reciprocity and Community Construction in the New Testament. And it's a very great pleasure for me now to introduce the first of these lectures, Is Altruism a Christian Virtue? A New Testament Perspective. Professor Barclay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that warm and very generous welcome. I count it a very great honour to be invited to give the Firth lectures this year, not least when I consider that awesome list of names of those who've given lectures, these lectures in recent years. It's a privilege to give these 2 lectures and the seminar tomorrow morning, and I'm looking forward to getting to know the MA students through these 3 events. And I'm taking this opportunity to float some ideas and arguments that enter into my current research on gift dynamics in early Christianity. The project that I'm working on at the moment has socio-historical and exegetical and theological dimensions, but among the concepts I'm trying to explore is the significance of reciprocity in the formation of early Christian communities. Now, gift reciprocity has in the modern world a mixed reputation. In some minds, it is associated strongly with bribery and other manipulative forms of self-interested giving. And in others, reciprocity appears to be a kind of compromised or watered-down version of proper giving, gift giving, which should be altruistic and disinterested in the sense of expecting no return. Thus, my historical, textual, and theological tasks need to be accompanied, I discovered, by some clear thinking about what we mean, not only by gift and reciprocity, but also altruism, and about how these terms have acquired the particular associations they assume to have today. In these 2 lectures, I hope to open up these issues for analysis and discussion, to outline the theologically grounded social vision to be found in the New Testament, and to examine in the second lecture some of the characteristics of community construction as advanced specifically by Paul. At the end of the second lecture, I will suggest some implications from our findings, not least for the ways we think about charity, church, and community development today, and thus I hope to meet some of that brief about the significance of Christian theology for contemporary issues. Now, you'll find an outline of this lecture on the handout that I trust everybody has. If you haven't, there's some more here if you need a copy of that. That will give you a sort of guide to where we're going in these lectures, and I hope it's helpful for you. Now, it's widely assumed, so I'm in my first section, altruism and egoism. It's widely assumed at both scholarly and popular levels that altruism is a Christian virtue. Indeed, a distinctively Christian contribution to the history of morality and to the welfare of society. No less an authority than Justin Welby put it recently, altruism, the imitation of the God who acts in love that does not seek a return, is a crucial part of a stable and functional society. But a little reflection on this matter should make us cautious. The term altruism was coined in the mid-19th century by Auguste Comte, the French positivist and father of sociology, who constructed a polarity between egoism and altruism, a polarity that is still widely current today. The word altruism is ultimately derived from the Latin alter, other, and Comte's contrasting of self and other is both a product of and a response to a complex set of economic, political, and social conditions that had changed the nature of Western society in the course of the 18th and 19th centuries. With the growing dominance of the market economy came philosophies and practices of competitive individualism, in which the self was increasingly viewed as an isolatable entity, an entity that calculated its benefits and optimized its advantage, and entered into social cooperation or contract only out of self-interest. The default state of humanity was the individual autonomous self with his or her selfish calculations. And Comte was concerned to advocate a counterbalancing, indeed contrary ethic, which suppressed selfishness for the sake of society as a whole. In his view, I quote, "The greatest problem of life is the ascendancy of altruism over egoism." Comte's polarity problematizes the self as a threat to the welfare of society. although Comte's financial supporter and partial admirer, John Stuart Mill, played down Comte's critiques of the individual while retaining his positive stress on what was called disinterested altruism. One of the things that attracted Mill to Comte's concept was that it constituted a morality that retained, in his view, the best of Christian ethics, but surpassed Christianity by offering a purer form of love than any religion had so far achieved. Although Comte called his philosophy a religion of humanity, he and Mill used the word religion only in a transferred sense, because they both wished to release ethics from the shackles of what they called supernaturalism, which they considered in fact to inculcate a form of subtle egoism. John Stuart Mill's treatise on the utility of religion expresses this viewpoint in particularly clear terms. The religion of humanity is, he insists, a better religion than any of those which are ordinarily called by that title. I quote him here, "For in the first place, it is disinterested. It carries the thoughts and feelings out of the self and fixes them on an unselfish object, loved and pursued as an end for its own sake. The religions which deal in promises and threats regarding a future life," he had Christianity particularly in mind there, "the religions which deal in promises and threats regarding a future life do exactly the contrary. They fasten down the thought to the person's own posthumous interests. They tempt him to regard the performance of his duties to others mainly as a means to his personal salvation, and are one of the most serious obstacles to the great purpose of moral culture, which is the strengthening of the unselfish and the weakening of the selfish element in our nature. In its effects on common minds," Mill had a very hierarchical sense of the superior minds and the common minds, but in its effects on the common minds, what now goes by the name of religion operates mainly through feelings of self-interest. This is a radical inferiority of the best supernatural religions compared with the religion of humanity. Today we would call this religion of humanity simply humanism, and its strategy is, as Nietzsche said, to out-Christianize Christianity, removing Christianity's moral vision from a theological frame which could be and was here characterized by Mill as fundamentally self-centered. Just as Luther had criticized Catholic practice as encouraging believers to seek selfishly their own benefit, attempting by good works to gain grace from God, Comte and Mill turn a similar critique on religions in general and Christianity in particular, as phenomena deeply infected by self-interest. The brave new morality that they advocated was superior and purer in offering a more consistent counterweight to what they called the selfish element in our nature. The strategy continues to our day. Dawkins offers as an altruistic ethic as the antidote to this selfishness built into our genes. You remember how Dawkins takes egoism, reads egoism into nature, the selfish gene, and gives it a scientific basis. The antidote, he says, is altruism. As he puts it, we can discuss ways of deliberately cultivating and nurturing a pure, disinterested altruism, something that has no place in nature, something that has never existed before in the history of the world. Pure, disinterested altruism is represented here as a new, that is, post-Christian morality, and one that atheist moralists such as Peter Singer can advocate with enthusiasm. Now, before we go any further, we should define what we mean by altruism, a term that has acquired, in fact, a spectrum of meanings since it was coined by Comte. Altruism could be taken in a simple, general sense as wanting to benefit others for their own sake. And one could add to that the rider with a Kantian tone that the benefit intended should have others always as ends and never as means to some other end, such as benefiting ourselves. But Comte's egoism altruism polarity gave the term a stronger sense, what we might call antithetical altruism. That is, an altruism specifically excluding any benefit to the self. Here, the benefit to others is altruistic only if it is completely disinterested, in the sense that self-interest is not just irrelevant, but is replaced by the interests of the other. On this definition, an altruistic gift is one where no return is sought or expected, and where reciprocity would be an accident rather than an ideal. And it is one that entails the loss, denial, renunciation, or sacrifice of the self, since the gift must come at some level at the expense of the self. This may be nuanced by saying that the loss or renunciation is only of external rewards, since it could be considered legitimate to think of doing good to others as a form of self-realization. But in general, what I'm calling antithetical altruism is nervous of claiming any benefit to the self, lest its purity be stained and its moral superiority be compromised. In forms influenced by Hannah Arendt and Jacques Derrida, even the gratification that comes from awareness of doing good to others annuls the gift. Good can exist, says Hannah Arendt, only when it is not perceived even by its author. And as Derrida famously insisted, for there to be a gift, there must be no reciprocity, return, exchange, countergift, or debt, not even in recognition of myself as a giver. The very moment you give something, you recognize and congratulate yourself. There's the return to you. That's no longer a gift. Ever since this formulation of antithetical altruism, it's been tempting for Christian theologians to claim that this is precisely what agape means. Did not Jesus call people to take up their cross and follow him? Did he not empty himself, becoming obedient even to death, when he loved us, in Paul's terms, and gave himself for us? This notion of altruism has in fact always found particular favour within the Lutheran tradition and its Kantian offspring. Luther's concern to break out of gift circularity in our relation to God led him to emphasize the unilateral giving of God, who gives while needing nothing in return. And Luther also figured the Christian as a kind of Christ who, I quote, lives only for others and not for himself, considering nothing except the need and advantage of the neighbor. Kierkegaard's insistence that, quote, wherever Christianity is, there is also self-renunciation, which is Christianity's essential form, that continues and extends this tradition, and it reaches its acme perhaps in Nygren's famous book Agape and Eros, which was in effect a long exposition of the final thesis of Luther's Heidelberg disputation. In Nygren's schema, Eros love is acquisitive love, egocentric love, motivated, and a form of self-assertion. Agape love, by contrast, gives itself away. It is unselfish, spontaneous, the supreme form of self-sacrifice. The self-other polarity is here fully operative, and something like this schema is strongly affirmed by theologians such as Colin Grant, who take Christian ethics to entail a version of this antithetical altruism. Now, to be sure, there have been Christian voices raised against this notion of altruism, and not just on the pragmatic grounds that it is unrealistic, extreme, or overly idealistic. An altruism that sacrifices the self can appear dangerous if preached to those who are already placed in a vulnerable or subordinate position, as feminist critics have rightly pointed out. While a unilateral giving that expects and receives no return can turn out to be condescending and domineering, humiliating those who are only ever receivers and never allowed to reciprocate in giving. Whether and in what sense or to what degree self-love is permissible or even necessary to Christian ethics continues to be a matter of dispute. But it's certainly possible to critique antithetical altruism on the grounds that it empties the self of the significance that gives meaning to the otherness of the other. I can hardly give to another if I at the same time obliterate myself, since I am the agent of the giving. But the danger in any such reassertion of the self is that it remains within the terms of the self-other contrast, even if it modifies or critiques Comte's antithetical formulation. In particular, its danger is that it reinscribes the modern Western notion of the self as an autonomous, isolatable individual, who might choose to associate with others, but only so far as the collective constitutes an aggregate of self-determining individuals, the whole being no more than the sum of its parts. We might do better, I think, to ask if there are models and social ideals that escape these ingrained individualistic assumptions and that can envisage a social good that does not entail an exclusive relation between the self and the other. Instead of a competitive zero-sum model where any benefit to myself detracts from the benefit of the other, or where complete disinterestedness is the only way to escape from selfishness, can we envisage systems of co-interest where the benefit to another is also a benefit to myself, without in the least diminishing or degrading my concern for the other? In very many cultures, notions of solidarity and reciprocity envisage just that. And it's not at all clear that they can or should be mapped onto the Comtean antithesis between egoism and altruism, for instance, as some kind of compromise midway position between these poles. I believe the New Testament may help us escape this zero-sum antithetical notion of altruism, even though the New Testament has sometimes been evoked as its prime exemplar. For this reason, I will argue that if altruism is defined in antithetical terms, that is, for the other, not the self, or as the gift seeking no return, if it's defined in such terms, it is, I think, a peculiarly modern moral aberration and not a Christian virtue at all. So my second section, from I and you to we, solidarity and reciprocity in the New Testament. Now, there are, to be sure, many places in the New Testament where injunctions are given against selfishness as seeking one's own good. Let no one seek his own good, says Paul, but that of the other. Love, one of the famous statements about love in 1 Corinthians 13, is that it does not seek its own good. Again, here Paul, give no offense to Jews or Greeks or to the church of God, just as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own benefit, but that of many, so that they may be saved. And so be imitators of me, as I am of Christ. This reference to the example of Christ reminds us of the instruction to the strong in Romans 15, that the strong should bear with the weaknesses of the powerless, and they are not to please themselves. Each of us must please our neighbor for the good, for upbuilding. For Christ did not please himself, as it is written, the reproaches of those who reproach you have fallen on me. The instructions not to seek your own good or to please yourself are directed against those whose selfish concerns for their own rights, even quite legitimate rights, causes detriment to others. In such circumstances, what must be sacrificed is the self positioned in competition with another, the self whose benefits would bring harm to others. That self must certainly be denied, as it is incompatible with the good of others. But what is striking is that the outcome of this action is not, as we might expect on the model of antithetical altruism, the benefit of the other to the exclusion of benefit to oneself. When the strong in Romans 14 and 15 cease to please themselves and so build up rather than destroy the weak, what happens is that both parties are able to engage in relationships that benefit each other. Let us then pursue what makes for peace and for building up one another. What Paul wants in Rome is not that the weak should benefit at the expense of the strong, but that by giving up legitimate rights, that by the strong giving up their legitimate rights, a social mutuality is created by which they are able, as he puts it, to welcome one another. A reciprocal relationship in which each is given the dignity of the host and the privilege of the guest. The opposite to selfishness is not, in modern terms, selflessness, but the solidarity in which I and you are incorporated into a communal we, in which our interests are conjoined and thus of benefit to all, both you and me. The same pattern can be traced in relation to Paul himself, who sometimes seems, on our reckoning, impressively self-denying, but then at other moments, also on our reckoning, excessively concerned with himself. By our modern polarity, in other words, he swings wildly from extreme selflessness to stunning self-interest. But it may be that the problem here is not with Paul, but with the polarity we have ourselves constructed. Paul forgoes his rights to financial support and works with his own hands to support himself so as to put no obstacle in the way of the gospel. More broadly, he says he has enslaved himself to all people, adapting to this cultural situation and that, often at considerable cost to himself, including imprisonment, beating, and eventually death. But again, the purpose of this action is not, as we might expect, the benefit of others to the exclusion of benefit to himself, as in antithetical altruism. Rather, the goal is that he should share with his converts in joy, that they, with him, should be presented blameless at the day of the Lord. His action in enslaving himself to others so that they may be saved does not exclude himself from this ultimate benefit. I do all of this, he says, on account of the gospel, in order that I may be a co-sharer, synkoinonos, in it. Synkoinonos indicates both aspects of the koinonia motif, both sharing with and sharing in. He shares with his converts in the benefits of the gospel, ensuring, as he says, that he is not disqualified from the race, but gains the crown. In other words, the sacrifices that Paul makes here are not about self-annihilation, the substitution of others for himself. He sacrifices whatever would put his good in competition with the good of others, but he has the aim that they should share together in the good that ultimately brings benefit to them all. Elsewhere, he shocks us by writing to Philemon from prison, saying, I request some benefit from you. And we think, how selfish is that? Characteristically, the benefit he wants is not some private good, but the benefit of Onesimus. It seems, in fact, he is so fully invested in Onesimus the slave, his new brother in Christ, that a benefit to Onesimus is also, at the same time, a benefit to Paul himself. What begins to emerge in these texts is a pattern in which the renunciation of a selfish private good, a good that would benefit me at the expense of others, the renunciation of that is designed to enable a non-competitive relationship in which the interests of all parties are sufficiently pooled that one need no longer think of the benefit of one coming at the expense of the benefit of others. Antithetical altruism retains the competitive ethos of self versus others. It simply flips from one exclusive benefit, mine over others, to its opposite, others over mine. What the New Testament suggests is moving out of the competitive spirit of selfishness, not into its polar opposite, disinterested self-renunciation, but into an alternative social ideal, which we might label co-interest or co-benefit. The chief characteristic of this ideal is that the interests of the self cannot be distinguished from the interests of others, and vice versa. Or to put it another way, the self as competitive individual is redefined as the self in solidarity with others. That self in solidarity is certainly not renounced, because it is so identified with others that to harm it would be to harm all. That solidarity can be expressed sometimes in terms of pooling, having all things in common, and sometimes in terms of reciprocity, benefiting one another. In either case, the benefit of one is inseparable from the benefit of all, so that it here makes no sense to pit them in competition or antithesis to each other. We may watch this pattern worked out in social and material terms in the Gospels, though it's somewhat clearer, I think, in the New Testament epistles. When Jesus calls people to follow him, he bids them to a considerable degree of self-denial. They leave homes, families, jobs, anything that would hinder their full commitment to being with Jesus. The rich are bidden to sell their possessions, which block their devotion to God, and to follow Jesus. If anyone wants to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Now this looks like the self-sacrifice for the sake of others, until we realize that following Jesus entails the integration of the follower into a new community, where each is cared for in the intensity of a kinship relation. Look, says Peter, we have left everything and followed you. To which Jesus replies, truly I tell you, there's no one who's left house or brothers or sisters or mother or father or children or fields for my sake and for the sake of the gospel, who will not receive 100-fold now in this age, houses, brothers and sisters, mothers and children and fields with persecutions, and in the age to come, eternal life. We'll come back to that in the age to come, eternal life bit in a moment. But for now we should note that what we have called the self in solidarity is by no means abandoned or annihilated here, but is part of a new family whose ethos is one of pooled resources. The rich man who sells his possessions and gives the proceeds to the poor is not to be left a starving beggar, destitute of networks of support. In Acts, Luke hints at what a radical wealth ethic looks like in lived practice when he speaks of the pooling of wealth, using the potent phrase, all things in common. In this solidarity of sharing, it's ensured, he says, that there was not a needy person among them. As we move from the hoarding of private property that for Luke represents the epitome of selfishness and greed, to its pooling in community, we move from a self versus others antithesis to the self in solidarity. And that self flourishes because all flourish together. Pooling in household relations indicates there is now, as it were, no space between self and other across which goods can be passed and exchanged. Relations are so close that everything is already in common. But the same social ideal can be expressed in terms of reciprocity, where goods and services are, as it were, passed from A to B, but the ties between them are so strong that B is committed to look after A just as urgently as A is committed to look after B. This is the model of reciprocity or mutuality that we find writ large all over the Pauline epistles, in the constant injunctions to love one another, to serve one another, to bear one another's burdens, and so on. We're going to come back to examine this material more closely tomorrow, but you can already sense, I hope, where I'm heading. The costly love that Paul enjoins moves the self out of a model of antithetical interests into a community where the I is so strongly identified with the interdependent we that its interests are mingled and conjoined with that of the collective whole. The self that is safeguarded and benefited here is not a selfish, competitive self, as if my giving was really, after all, for my and only my benefit. All benefits are here shared in modes of mutual exchange. The self, in other words, is not given away, but given into community. And there, as a new and or reconstituted self, it can no longer be framed in isolatable terms. Here, nothing can ever be for my benefit if my benefit means mine, not others. By the same token, the benefit of others can and will include my benefit without being subtly instrumental for my selfish gain. But what about those texts in the Gospels that advocate a love that reaches out beyond the circles of reciprocity, that stretch love outward beyond family, friends, and trusted partners to include all, even enemies? If you do good to those who do good to you, says Jesus in Matthew, what's special about that? If you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing than others? Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Do we not find here a precursor of modern antithetical altruism in the sense that there is benefit for others and no possible benefit for oneself, a gift that is not returned and is all the purer and better for not being returned, a one-way gift of loving self-expense? Is this not precisely what makes the Jesus ethic distinctive, even supreme? What is certainly distinctive here is the willingness to risk a gift that elicits no return, the move beyond the limits of assured reciprocity to initiate relationships where there is no guarantee that the other will be willing to share his self with you as you share yourself with him. We shall see in a moment what grounds the ability to take this risk, but I would interpret even these instructions as having as their aim not a one-way relationship of gift without return, but the creation of new friendships, the turning of enemies into friends. When someone sues you and takes your shirt, as in Jesus' saying in Matthew 5, it's because that person thinks he has a legal right to your shirt. If you let him have it, you concede the legal case, but the relationship remains hostile. The shirt's presumably collateral for a debt. That's why somebody might sue you for your shirt. Go further, says Jesus, and let him have your outer garment, your hemation, as well. Now that is not his right, but it will appear clearly as a gift. And the purpose of this gift, as always in antiquity, is to create a relationship, to draw the other into a friendship of gift and return. You may not succeed, and your generous gesture may be exploited. But your goal in this is not to shame your opponent or simply to take the moral high ground by being more generous than necessary, but to effect reconciliation and to re-establish your relationship with your suer on new, better grounds. As Matthew makes clear earlier in chapter 5, the way to deal with hostility is to effect reconciliation. Leave your gift at the altar, first be reconciled with your brother. And as early Christian interpreters rightly say, the point of loving your enemies is to turn them into your friends. In other words, the gift is here remarkable in its reach, stretching out to all, even to the hostile. It's unconditioned by the prior worth or behavior or attitude of its recipient. But its purpose is not to leave you and your enemy as isolated, independent individuals, but to draw you both into a shared and mutual belonging. There is a large risk that you may fail in this aim, but the unconditioned gift has as its aim the establishment of reciprocal ties. It comes, if you like, with strings attached. Strings that may never take hold, but are designed to take hold where possible, because in the ties of interdependent friendship, both you and your enemy will be better fulfilled. Now, is this true of Jesus also? Did he not empty himself and give up his life? Did he not truly give his life away? And is his death not the paradigm of altruism in the sense of the sacrifice of the self to core? Now, I don't have time to explore that question fully here, but here is the outline of how I would respond. Jesus may certainly be said to have given himself, and his death serves as the paradigm of giving oneself for others. But even here, Jesus gives himself into a relationship with others, not that he be permanently obliterated and others saved in his place and in his absence, but that they be saved with him. in the newness of life which God guarantees through his resurrection. In the Gospels, you will remember that Jesus speaks before his death of the table and the kingdom that he will share after death with his disciples. He assures the penitent thief that today you will be with me in paradise. If Jesus dies for others, it is not ultimately to substitute their lives for his, because their salvation is only possible and complete if it is a life with him, not apart from him. As Paul puts it, Christ died for us so that whether we are awake or asleep, we might live with him. As Sam Wells has recently pointed out, the goal of God's gift to and for us is ultimately that we should be with him and with each other. The final word is not instead of us, but with us. The Derridean notion, advanced by John Caputo and others, that God's gift means that God gives himself away to self-negation. John Caputo says the greatest thing about God is that God has obliterated himself. That's what gift ultimately means. That seems to me makes no sense, as the purpose of the gift would thereby be foiled. That notion may be the logical conclusion of a modern construal of antithetical altruism, but it ends up not as the supreme expression of the gospel, but as its annulment. In going to his death, Jesus does not withhold himself, and he takes the risk of a futile gesture that will have no positive effect. In that sense, we may speak of his death as a sacrifice, but only if we note that the purpose of this gift, and by God's power its actual effect, is that Jesus is not obliterated. His self is given to us so that ourselves may be conjoined with his, and thereby, in this solidarity with his life and his love, be brought to our common fulfillment. He participates in our condition so that we might participate in his, not without him, but with him, as children and heirs with and in the resurrected Son and heir. So my final section, reward as participation in the love of God. To speak in such terms brings us to the final part of this lecture and to consideration of Christian gift or love as a form of participation in the giving and loving of God. Drawing on their Jewish and scriptural heritage, the writers of the New Testament frame all human gift-giving, including gift reciprocity, in theological terms. But the way they bring God into the picture takes several different forms. In some cases, God or Christ is represented as the example of generosity to be imitated. Be merciful as your heavenly Father is merciful, as Jesus puts it in Luke. Or as we've seen in Paul, be imitators of Christ who did not please himself. Imitation is good as far as it goes, but it doesn't penetrate very far. Examples remain merely external to the moral agent. Other texts press deeper by figuring God not so much as the example, but as the source of grace and generosity that flows into the world through and in human generosity. That's certainly the implication of Paul's discussion of grace and gift in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, where the charis that the believers in Macedonia and Corinth are expected to contribute to Jerusalem is not just an imitation of the charis of God, but its continuation or outflow. God is able, says Paul, to provide you with every blessing in abundance, so that by always having enough of everything you may share abundantly in every good work. One may figure believers then as conduits for this grace, paying it forward in generosity to others. Though again, the image of the conduit or channel, which was used, for instance, by Luther, perhaps remains too impersonal to do full justice to the truth. Alongside the role of example and source, God may also be figured in New Testament discourse as the instructor of generosity, the giver of the new command of love. More intimately, however, God may also be figured as the ultimate or real recipient of generosity, following the model of Proverbs, where whoever is kind to the poor lends to the Lord and will be repaid in full. The notion of the poor as a proxy for God is utilized by Jesus in a number of gospel sayings, most fully, of course, in the parable of the sheep and the goats, where whatever you did or didn't do for the least of these my brothers, you did or didn't do to me. This brings God or Jesus more intimately into the human gift-giving, and closely parallel is the notion that God or Jesus is the guarantee of the reward or return. Now, it's frequently emphasized by those who advocate a Christian version of antithetical altruism that Jesus emphasizes generosity to the ungrateful as well as the grateful, to enemies and not just friends, and that he urges in some circumstances that gift be given in secrecy, so that no one knows and congratulates you on your giving. Even your left hand doesn't know what your right hand is doing. This surely, it is argued, is unreciprocated generosity, the unique glory of the Christian tradition. What's less frequently noticed is that at precisely the same time, these Gospels speak of a return or reward from God, even and especially when none is forthcoming from human beings. Let your almsgiving be done in secret, says Matthew, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Love your enemies, do good, and lend, expecting nothing back, and your reward will be great. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap, for the measure you give will be the measure you get back. Luke 6. As things are figured here, the gift is one way only at the human level. There will certainly be return, but it will come from God. Reciprocity is not denied, but rather, as it were, outsourced. It will come from God in another form and at another time. Now, as in the Old Testament, one function of figuring God as the one who rewards the gift is that this grounds and supports the practice of giving to the poor, who have nothing worthwhile to reciprocate. Their only return can be to call down blessings on your head, and thus to look to God to reward your generosity. In Jewish wisdom texts, this is figured largely in this worldly terms, but in later Jewish texts with an eschatological horizon, and in the New Testament, the return is deferred to a future time and place. Luke's Gospel, I think, makes a special point of looking past, as it were, a human return in expectation of a return from God. When you give a dinner, says Jesus in Luke 14, don't invite your family or rich neighbors, for they will invite you back and you'll be repaid. Instead, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. What looks at one level like a gift expecting no return, an idea integral to modern antithetical altruism, turns out to be very different. It does expect a return, only not from the human guests, and not now. Now, the language of reward can take multiple forms. It can be represented as pay in return for labor. Misthos can mean both pay and reward. It can be represented as the harvest that follows sowing, as the treasure laid up in heaven, or as the crown presented to the victorious athlete. Whatever the metaphor, the language has proved something of an embarrassment to Protestant interpreters of the New Testament, especially to those in the Lutheran tradition who, as we noted earlier, prefer to think of human gifts as one way, sourced in God, but neither needing nor expecting any return. And as we've seen, this notion of rewards was the prime case presented by John Stuart Mill for his argument that Christianity was not properly altruistic, since the promise of reward betrays a hidden self-concern, fastening down, as he puts it, the thought to the person's own posthumous interests. So is this talk of reward ultimately the ruination of Christian ethics? Should it be cut out of Christian ethical discourse in order to fit the modern model of antithetical altruism? Or can it be retained and interpreted in a way that is theologically fruitful, even if it cannot fit what modern pure altruists would demand? As we've seen, what I'm calling modern antithetical altruism works on the premise that the self and the other stand in a necessarily competitive relation to one another. Either others are sacrificed to the self, or the self is sacrificed to others. On this model, any reference to benefit to oneself, present or future, will be to the detriment of benefit to others. And any reference to eschatological reward signals that the self is, after all, the centre of concern, with the welfare of others only instrumental to that ultimately selfish end. Now, if the metaphors of eschatological reward in the New Testament would lead us to commodify the benefits of generosity, and particularly if they lead us to imagine those benefits too much in individualized, exclusivist terms, they may well prove damaging to theology. But they don't have to be interpreted in those terms. If, as we've seen, the dominant models of salvation in the New Testament are not about the satisfaction of the isolatable individual, but about the incorporation of the self in a mutually beneficial solidarity, we may certainly speak of the reward or fulfillment of that self in solidarity as the ultimate goal and fulfillment of our gifts. Here the conceptuality of participation becomes particularly important as it comes to expression most deeply in the theologies of Paul and John. At its deepest level, human generosity is not just sourced in God and not just imitative of the goodness of God, it is a participation in the self-diffusing love of God, a transformation of the self in relationship both to God and to others. God's grace, we may say, gives us not something, but someone, God, Godself, and thereby gives us ourselves, a transformed self that lives from and in the life and love that is drawn from God. To love is, as John puts it, to abide in the love of God and to have the love of God abide in us. As Paul puts it, it is to say, it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. I take the language of eschatological reward in the New Testament to point to precisely this reality, fulfilled and completed, this reality of participation in God, fulfilled and completed on terms beyond any material, commodified understandings of return. To love, in theological terms, is not only to let the self be taken up into the self in solidarity with others that we traced in some New Testament texts, it is to participate, or better, to co-participate in the love of God. And here, in the love of God, our natures and destinies will be fulfilled, not as an individualized benefit, but as a shared and conjoined benefit in which the self becomes most truly and fully itself, not in autonomy and competition, but in codependence and co-enjoyment of the love of God. Because Mill, John Stuart Mill, like many of his successors, cannot escape the modern conceptualization of the competitive I, he cannot take any reference to the benefit of the self as other than a dilution and diminution of benefit to others. If this self is to be rewarded or fulfilled, that only shows it was never truly or fully committed to bring others, to bring benefit to others. Christian attempts to salvage a claim to altruism on these modern antithetical terms struggle, I think, to make sense of the New Testament language of eschatological reward, except as an unfortunate hangover of a pre-Christian conceptuality. More generally, in adhering to the modern antithetical model, they decline to allow any sense of benefit to the self, lest it seem to detract from the altruistic purpose of benefit to the other. Alternatively, and no better, they affirm that some forms of self-benefit are all right after all, whether framed as self-love or self-realization. But if this self remains the competitive self of the modern imagination, the autonomous bounded self, which is always finally separable from the other, we've failed, I think, to catch the richer vision offered by the New Testament. Altruism, in the antithetical sense of a benefit to others to the exclusion of benefit to myself, is not, I would suggest, a Christian virtue. Altruism, in the simpler sense of benefiting others for their own sake, is certainly integral to Christian notions of love, but I suspect that the term altruism is so loaded by modern connotations and springs from such modern presuppositions that it is best left outside the vocabulary of Christian theology and ethics. We have a perfectly good word for what we want to say, and that is love. And since love can issue in mutually benefiting solidarity with others, and since love is itself a fulfilling participation in the love of God, whatever elements of sacrifice it may contain do not need to entail the annihilation of the self, at least the self as redefined and reconstituted in love. Thanks very much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. That was splendid. We have about half an hour for questions, and I'm sure there will be many questions. Just to reiterate the point that was made earlier, that before you begin to ask your question, you need to have the microphone in your hand. And we have Chris on the left and Tom on the right with mics.
Hi, thank you so much, John. I enjoyed that very much. And I guess my questions are not directly related to Luther, but they're related to the kind of concerns he had, I think. So the question of gift giving, as you've described it, I completely see and buy that the mode in which, as it were, the ego is reconfigured in Christian terms is as a we, rather than simply as an effacement. And that the early Christian community and so on, that there's just so much more going on than simply the erasure of egoism. And I think the non-competitive sort of logic is very valuable there. My question, though, the way that you framed gift giving, especially about the question of expectation of return, is to a substantial degree, it's a question of intent. And so one way of reading the non-competitive gift giving that you're describing is as it's possible to have multiple intents, both to help the other and to be helped in some way. And I think that's where I guess I don't think, I'm sure that's possible, and in fact probably unavoidable, just in practice. My question, though, is so the problem is, though, I guess, that some gift giving with intent is manipulative and coercive and uncomfortable. And if ever you've been the object of gifts that are, because it feels like not a gift because really someone's just trying to get me to do something without actually just asking. So that it's that worry and the ways in which intent can be problematic. And selfish intent can actually obviate the mutual benefits. So I think ideally, yes, but what about the non-ideal gift exchange?
Yeah, I'm going to say more about that tomorrow, actually. But it's an obvious and it's a good question. I think, and I may be painting an ideal here, but where gifts work well is where the intent is for a return because the return is good for both parties. That's to say, it is good for you to be in a position of giving to me. I use just a very, very simple illustration here. When my daughter was very young, and she's one of these people, her language of love is giving, okay? She loves giving. Now, when she was very young, it comes up to Christmas, she wants to be able to give presents. And of course, she doesn't have any money except the little bits of pocket money that I give her. And I could have said, I'll forget it. Don't bother with Christmas this year because you're only going to be giving me my own money back again, or whatever. And you could have a kind of, well, let's forget gifts then. Of course, that would have been devastating for her. I'm giving her, in a sense, by giving her pocket money, I'm giving her the privilege, the dignity, the power of being a giver. And that's very, very important, not just for her, but for all of us, to be able. Now, that can be manipulated. I'm fully aware of that. But there is a sense in which it can be good for you that I expect a return, and not just good for me. And here's where we don't have to play off these two things against one another.
Thank you. I'd like to start really from your last point about the dignity and power of being a giver. And where I'm heading to, if I can give my question in advance, is surely eternal life is more than participating in the Athenian demos or the Prussian state. I mean, surely there's a lot more in the New Testament than there is in Aristotle or Hegel. So to what extent can eternal life be fully explained in terms of participation? I'm not doubting that Johannine and Pauline theology places a huge emphasis on participation, but it seems to me that there's something more in it. Even in things that you quoted, such as Galatians 2:20, it's no longer I that live. There must be something else going on. And to get to some clarity, I think it's better to stop talking about selves, but talk about the things we're considering. So if we're considering shirts, you're wearing a very nice shirt, but unfortunately I can't wear it at the same time as you. It's got to be yours, or you give it to me, or I give it to someone else. It's got to be yours or mine. If we're talking about shirts, then we are in a zero-sum competitive scenario. Whereas if we're talking about friendship, I can't be a friend unless I have friends to be friends with. So friendship is necessarily participatory. But I wonder if there's other things discussed in the New Testament, such as the power to be a giver, which involves something essential to the individual. Or you were also talking about concern. There's also things such as attention, there's time, and if the New Testament is drawing us away from a concern over shirts, or at least shirts as objects of benefits rather than media of relationships, perhaps it's also calling us to something beyond thinking in terms of friendship, which is to do with the generative source of friendship and relationship, in which one could say, the time that we have, we can only give, but ourselves, our lives are constituted by the time that is given to us, both by others and by our very existence, or by God.
Yeah, that's very helpful, and I perhaps didn't bring that out as clearly as I could. Absolutely, the participation that I'm talking about is a participation both, if you like, at the horizontal level, socially, participation in relationships with one another. But the way koinonia is used in the New Testament is about not just sharing with one another, but sharing in the koinonia in grace, as Paul puts it, or the koinonia in the Spirit. So the social, if you like, the human-to-human koinonia is grounded in and enabled by and sourced by the koinonia that is God's love or life, or the gift of the Spirit. So I agree. The trouble with the word gift is it tends to reify things. That's why I say the most important thing is grace is not a thing, but God's self. What God gives us is God's self rather than things, or rather through the things God gives us God's self. And so I read the language of eschatological fulfillment or eschatological reward as the fulfillment of the self in being drawn into and completed in deeper participation in what's already been the reality of human life participation. Is that making sense? Is that meeting what you're saying? I think the participation into which we are drawn through the gospel, as far as the New Testament concerned, then is not just a better version of Plato's Republic or a better version of Aristotle's friendship, because in that friendship and in that family, rather than political terms usually in the New Testament, in that family, one becomes codependent and co-participants in the love that has created us and redeemed us and will fulfill us. Yeah.
Thank you. Just following on from your response to that last question, I wondered if you would want to call this a Trinitarian ethic then?
Yes. Now, this is where you're going to take me outside of my field a little bit, though I tend to stray outside my field. Absolutely. I think, one of the things actually I find very puzzling is how people who believe very strongly in a kind of a love, that the love is perfected by not being reciprocal, they then turn around and talk about the Trinity, which is about the persons of the Trinity giving to one another. I think, what's that if it's not reciprocity? So I think you can certainly read this in a Trinitarian, with Trinitarian frame. I think I'm speaking from my New Testament base. You have to say that is an extrapolation. I'm not saying it's an unjustified one, but it's extrapolation from Johannine language in particular about the love between the Father and the Son and the Spirit as the Paraclete. So certainly you can go that way, and certainly it's one of the things. I was reading Sam Wells's book. I was quoting from his Nazareth Manifesto. He says, the ultimate purpose of God is not to do to us or for us, but to be with us, and he bases that in a Trinitarian theology. And I think one can get to the same end result from many different angles. I would find it hard to make the Trinitarian case purely on the basis of the New Testament, but I'm certainly not wanting to put an absolute divide between those. So absolutely yes.
Hi John, thank you. That was wonderful. So thank you. I'm really looking forward to tomorrow already. I guess similar to Philip, I had a question about participation. And I think in the same way that the Christian hope is more than, or at least not exclusively, participation in the life of God, I wonder if Christ's reward is more than having humanity participate in the life of God, with him. And I'm thinking of Hebrews, where Christ goes to the cross for the joy set before him, and in Philippians, where Jesus is given the name above all names, and every tongue will confess that he is Lord, or Correos, however we want to translate that. So I wonder if you could speak about how that kind of non-participatory element of Christ's reward, which humanity, I presume, doesn't participate in, would cohere with your matrix of solidarity and reciprocity that you want to construct in this. Thank you. Well,
I'm finding it hard to think what could be a higher or greater end than participation in the life and love of God. But what Philippians says is, because God has raised him, he will transform our lowly bodies to be like his glorious body. So what has happened in the resurrection is the establishment of a new order of being, if you like, a resurrection order of being, which we will share only in as much as we are in Christ. But what we will share, we won't share, if you like, in the lordship of Christ, but we will share in the newness of life that the resurrection of Christ has made actualized. This is where you'd have to get into a long discussion about what we mean by participation in the life and love of God, and I haven't used the word theosis because that can mean so many different things in different theological traditions. But it doesn't, my understanding of participation in the life or the love of God does not entail becoming God. The difference between God and us at certain points, I think, remains. And in a sense, there has to be a difference for love to pass between us. But I think this, I do think, I've come increasingly to think that the points in the New Testament where you get the fullest and deepest understandings of what salvation is about are those places in John and Paul, who in very different language, utterly different language, seem to converge at this point of participation. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think this is the moment to draw the first part of the Firth Lectures 2018 to a close, and to thank Professor Barclay extremely warmly for an immensely erudite, scholarly, clear presentation of the, and also pertinent for our situation today, of the borderlines between the New Testament ethics and philosophy. Thank you very much.